We start with that breaking news. NBC News has just confirmed that one of President Trump's longtime friends, a man who may know his secrets better than just about anyone, was granted immunity in the Michael Cohen case. His name is Michael Pecker. He is the CEO of the company that publishes the National Enquirer. Let's start with the man who breaks a lot of stories for us here at NBC News. Tom Winter is with me. Hans Nichols is standing by for us at the White House. Tom, tell us all that you know. Walk us through this and why this is potentially so important.
So, Craig, this story was first reported by the Wall Street Journal, and it's that in the course of the Michael Cohen investigation, which of course wrapped up on Tuesday with his guilty plea to 8 counts here in New York, that in the course of that investigation, federal prosecutors gave David Pecker, the CEO of American Media, immunity in that case to help with their investigation. And this directly relates to count 7, one of the counts that involves potentially the President of the United States here, or implicates the President of the United States directly, and it is tied to Karen McDougal. There was a payment of $150,000 made to Karen McDougal by American Media. Of course, David Pecker is the CEO of that company, and as you said, they're the company that owns the National Enquirer. And so they made that payment to Karen McDougal according to the charges at the direction of the President of the United States through Michael Cohen. So this is one of the 2 counts that has to do with payments that were made to women during the course of the election process, directed by the President of the United States and orchestrated by Michael Cohen. So when you look at that specific charge and you see that David Pecker was granted immunity, presumably he was able to tell prosecutors exactly how this worked, exactly how this payment came to be, and was able to provide some testimony. We also know that, as we've reported earlier this week, as you and I talked yesterday, that they have, there's text messages, communications, all sorts of different evidence that federal prosecutors and federal investigators were able to get in this case. So presumably some of his testimony could walk them through some of that evidence that they were able to get, some of those communications further corroborate it, or vice versa, things that he was able to tell prosecutors they were able to corroborate with some of the evidence that was taken from Michael Cohen as part of that court-authorized search. So this is somebody who, based on reports that we've seen before and leading up to this guilty plea by Michael Cohen, somebody who's had a long-term relationship with the president that predates his presidential run, that predates really a lot of his politics that we've seen here in the last couple of years. So the fact that he was given immunity, presumably that means that he was able to give prosecutors information that was helpful to them, and he was able to do so by being granted that immunity. Yeah. He was able to do so without his fear of being of either being indicted or getting into criminal trouble himself. It
would seem as if this is another instance, with David Pecker here, this is another instance where one of the president's friends or confidants has flipped.
Yeah, I would say it's a little bit different in technical terms, but yeah, if you want to look at it from a broader picture, this is somebody who's very close to the president, who is either admitted guilt, as Michael Cohen did, or is somebody who is cooperating and providing information about illegal activity that the president may have been privy to or directly involved in. So yeah, this is another person that's close to him that is involved in legal trouble and is somebody who has decided to either cooperate or capitulate and plead guilty.
Do we know whether this is all that David Pecker told prosecutors? Do we know if there's other information that Mr. Pecker might have provided to prosecutors unrelated to this particular case, but perhaps related to another case involving the president or Michael Cohen?
Mm-hmm. So that's the exact question to ask, and I think at this point we don't know yet if his information went beyond this specific count 7, that's in the criminal information that I have here, or whether or not this goes to any sort of other active investigation that's ongoing. Of course, we know that the case involving Michael Cohen was coordinated with and in conjunction with the special counsel's office, Robert Mueller. So does he have anything that extends beyond that? We don't know. We would presume perhaps that it's tightly correlated to this specific allegation and the specific payment. But right now, Craig, we don't know if it goes beyond that.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.